Now, we want to put this in an essay. I just want to make things very simple. Yeah, I don't want to get bogged down with the technicalities of forms and stuff like that. However, I need to touch on several main things that you have to remember about essay writing. Is that we start the paragraph with an opening, which is the question that we created a while ago. What makes Curious George funny? Or in this case, perhaps you want to focus on the education. What makes Curious George to be educative or didactic? It's good to play around. Yeah, that's the whole point of mind mapping, that you have to find a question that you really like to explain the answer to your audience. An example, and we can after the opening part, we move on to the content, the main body of your essay, which is about examples and discussion. You have to take examples from the actual text, or the actual cartoon in this case, that you watch, and you relate them to your discussion, how it's funny, how it's friendly, how it's cute. Now, I will show you the part in the book that resembles this. So in this case, we see the student notes about the short story that was, or rather an anecdote, I think, from Emily Wu, The Lesson of the Master. So instead of mind mapping, the student makes a draft, which is a good thing. So you do brainstorming, you do mind mapping, and then you make a draft, and then you try to connect this, try to make this into a prototype of a writing. So it's easier to later then translate this into a working essay. So you just write a draft, yes, and then you would turn this, these are ideas, yeah, and then you probably change this whole thing into a paragraph. You can do that. And here you see the discussion here. For example, in this content, we are told that the merchant began to fret. So he took this sentence directly from the source. You need to do this. You cannot just say things out of your head and not show the real examples of the things that you want to show. In this case, probably you need to describe a scene in Curious George, or you want to describe you take a screenshot of it to show that Curious George is funny, for example, and you have to include this example. And then this is another example. The merchant was beside himself with joy. So these are another example. So he took 3 examples and then make a discussion out of it. In short, we understand that the merchant is a person with ordinary feelings, etc. So this is the what you call it, the analysis of the examples. So this is a good way to do your discussion, examples, and then analysis. Of course, you can always do another further analysis of that analysis or observation, and the discussion can flow. Like in this case, for example, you don't see an example here because he's still talking about this one. So he continues that discussion. So that is how you write an essay. The discussion is the body, the one that makes your argument valid or not. After that, you go to the closing, which is to answer the question. So yes, you repeat the question in your closing paragraph. You answer the question. You give a summary. You make a list of the things that you have said. And then you add conclusion if you can. So what's the difference between summary and conclusion? The difference is that a summary is just a shortened version of something. A conclusion is, it can be your opinion, or it can be a step forward from just making a summary. Example, you see someone, let's give a picture here. So the summary of this picture, for example, is that there is a mountain, there is a train, there is these two characters. One is George, one is the yellow hat man. Now, these are the summary. You just list. However, if you want to make a conclusion out of this, you might say, the picture is nice. So it's a step forward from just making a short version of something. So let's continue with this. The best way is for you to have a summary and a conclusion for this one. This is the basic structure of your essay. Now let's continue. Now, the usual problems when you start trying to analyze a work of literature is that you cannot find a question. Usually it means that you don't really understand that text. We read that text, ask for others' opinions. Second reason may be that you have a question, but you can't find the proof or the things that support you in that text. It is possible that you need to revise your question. Change your question into something that your text can provide. If not, if you're still stumped, you always use the internet and use the dictionary to get an idea. What about dictionary? It goes like this. For example, let's go back to the text here on the book, chapter 2. So you look at this draft, for example, yeah, and we see this example. The merchant began to fret. What is fret? So it is important to know this kind of stuff, and the best way to do it is to look at the dictionary online to see what fret means. In this case, it means to whine or to complain. However, there is a different nuance or different additional meaning to fret. It means that it becomes more annoying than just to complain. Complain is less, less subjective, and it can be very objective. But fret is a very personal kind of feeling that it's almost like a child is fretting, while a man complains. So it gives more sense of subjectivity and immaturity to fret than the complain, which is a synonym of fret. This kind of stuff, you need to read the dictionary. So, well, you don't need to look at the dictionary for everything. You have to look at the important parts of your short story or your drama or your poem, especially poems. And then you have to look at the words in those to make sure that you understand all of it. So you look at the specific parts, the important parts, and then you try to understand those parts fully. If you cannot, look everything in the dictionary, and I do not recommend so. Yeah. So in this case, when you can't really find something like proofs or anything in the text, you're welcome to use sources from the internet and the dictionary to help you understand more about the text or about the things that you may miss in the text. However, I really have to warn you about not actually taking word by the internet, copy paste them into your work and say that it is your work. That will be plagiarism, and I am very serious when I say that I give you a very hard punishment for plagiarism. I will just tell you to redo it again. If I found that your work that you submit to me is taken directly from the internet, you do not change it in any way, you don't make it better, and then I would consider that as plagiarism. So it is probably a good idea not to take a topic that has already been talked about so much before, because there is a bigger possibility that you will just copy somebody else's work without you knowing it. In that case, let me know and we maybe can talk something about it. Now, the last problem that you usually find is how to actually discuss it. Now, I already give you the structure, but I'm not talking about the structure of your essay. I'm talking about what if you can't really make a very good uh, discussion out of it. Like you don't know how to explain all of this because you see there is no explanation of the discussion here. Now, uh, let's take a different example here. Now, this is a very already set what you call it observation. It's very definitive. George is funny. What if I take a different way and say that George is not funny? The whole idea here is I can't really explain why Curious George is not really funny. So I changed this into my opinion, my biggest thing that I want to talk about Curious George is that I don't like it. I don't care if it is a famous one. I don't care that many people like it. I just don't like it. And I think it is worth talking. So obviously the subject is George. So we're still talking about characterization here. And we limit the scope. George is very general into is not interesting. I have not found yet why George is not interesting. And I can't really describe why George is like that. George is not interesting. I get the sense probably that he doesn't act like a kid because he's a monkey. And I don't like it that way. So first thing you do is that you read again the material or find other sources in the internet to get an idea. How you should explain that idea is that, for example, the easiest one is to do a comparison with something which is comparable. Yes, it has to be comparable with one that you're talking about. We cannot compare Curious George. In this case, I take SpongeBob SquarePants, which is a comparable one. You cannot compare Curious George, for example, to I don't know, Games of Thrones, because they're very different media. You cannot compare Curious George to Shakespeare, because they're very different. But you can compare it, George, to SpongeBob SquarePants. SpongeBob, I really like SpongeBob, and I think it's a very successful cartoon, and I like it. No problem with SpongeBob. Now, in order to really explain Curious George, I need to take a hint from SpongeBob. Example here, Curious George, if you know from the design and how he looks like, is more realistic than SpongeBob. I mean, a sponge. Does a sponge has a face? I don't think so. So SpongeBob is more fantasy. It's more funny that way. It's more slapstick. Well, Curious George is more about education, and I found that boring. We get this idea from comparison. Well, this is one way to explain it. Now I revise what I said before. Now this is what I said before. I don't like it with Watch George. Still the same, because I'm still talking about George. Now I limit the scope. When I say it's not interesting, it's very general. What aspect is not interesting? I say it is not as enjoyable as a cartoon. How is it limited? Enjoyable. Instead of just interesting, I'm saying enjoyable. And I limit this to the media of cartoon. A definitive answer to this is that it is too serious. It's not fantasy enough, it's too educational, it's just too serious. Describe why too educational, not imaginative, and boring. So you see, this is very general, this is less general, this is very specific. You can get these ideas after you usually do your brainstorming and your mind mapping and writing your like a scratch draft that the student do on chapter 2 that you just saw. Chapter 2 of the book. You just write something and then you think. Yeah, and then you can answer this thing. So it's important to do those steps. Don't just jump from, for example, reading Curious George and you just try to explain, because it's even for people like me, for example, who has written quite a bit about literature. we still go back and forth because we are human. The more we observe, the more we get something. So it's definitely a good idea to follow all these steps and to, in order to get a good observation and therefore find something really interesting to talk about. Instead of going really fast and talk about something that you can't really explain, or you talk about something that it's so boring. Like you say, Curious George is funny. Everybody knows that. You don't have to explain that to anybody because everybody knows Curious George is funny or that Curious George is famous. You don't need an explanation. You just need a number of sales to tell people about that. However, if you want to say, I don't like Curious George, you need to make a very good explanation and people will be more interested to hear what you say because it requires more thinking. Yes? So let us continue. Now, what we talk about, you remember that when we talk about this, it's a good idea to start your study if you read more about it, especially focusing on the elements, the author, or the culture. Those are the three things that people usually talk about. The elements in this case, if I choose a short story, will be plot, characters, and narrative perspective, and then setting. So we talked about George, and he's a character, yes? So this whole thing about character, but usually characters deals with how believable they are, how appropriate or how interesting they are. And it's a good idea to focus on these things, usually, for characters, yes? If we take about settings, not characters, usually some ideas will be about framing. How is the actions, in this case, actions, or things that happening in the story, the plot, the characters, how does the setting help to contribute to that? And how is the setting affects the characters and actions? So the focus here is on setting, but you can still talk about characters and etc. because the literary work is a unity. Yeah, we just focus on one element, for example, characters, characterization, setting, etc., or the author or the culture. But we can talk about all the elements that can help us support our idea about that literary work. For example, I want to talk about George, Curious George, and how funny he is. I start with a characterization, and I focus on characterization because it's about George. But then I can introduce other elements as a secondary or as a supporting ideas. So you need to have focus, yeah? That is what I said when you want to limit your scope. You cannot talk about everything in a literary work. That will be inefficient. Takes a lot of time and people just cannot focus that way. You can also, for setting, you can also like how the setting creates a mood or the feeling or the emotion of it. And of course this deals with the atmosphere of that setting. So let us look at the example of this discussion about a setting. I'm taking here from Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of the House of Usher that we talked about a while ago while we talked about the prose fiction. You want to look at the setting, yes? So you focus on a description of setting, of course. In this case, I already put into the highlights, the red ones, about how the description here really sets the mood or set the emotional state of the reader. Let us read this. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom. Now here, the thing with dictionary becomes really important. You might not know exactly what is gloom. Is it the same with darkness? How is it different? Gloom is more scary than just dark. So it's more like in the feeling realm. Pervaded. What is pervaded? So it's a very good idea, and of course everyone does it. Even let's say native English speakers here, of course, don't use dictionaries that are English Indonesian. use English dictionary in this case to find the definition of those English words, and not, again, not the translation. Pervaded means like fully consume or fully take, fully invade too. I looked upon the scene before me, my house, and simple. So there is a house, and simple landscape features of the domain upon the bleak walls, the vacant eye-like windows, the rank here means smelly, smelling bad, sedges, part of the landscape, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees with an utter depression of soul. So the theme of the setting here, the general idea about the setting here is consistently dark, gloom, bleak, and scary, vacant, eye-like, scary, decayed, depression. So the whole idea, the whole setting is terrible, a bad place. Now, obviously, setting you usually do if you do characterization, you might compare, for example, or see how believable it is. But it's very helpful if you want to talk about the setting as the focus, that you visualize those. In this case, this will be a better visualization of the description that we just read before. The vacant eye-like windows, the rank sedges, the gloom, the depression is here, and obviously not here. However, this brings us to another kind of explanation that if you remember, we compare Curious George with SpongeBob. But what if we found something, and in that case we focus how Curious George was, for example, not good, and how SpongeBob is good. It is always good to play with what ifs. What if this happened instead of that? For example, what if the setting of Poe's description, we change that in something really beautiful and sunny? Would that affect the storytelling? Now, if it does, then it means that that element is very important to the discussion. So we should play with what if scenarios, with the what if I change this element? Does it have any bigger impact? Does it have any large impact? If it does, then it means that element is worth talking about, and it is an important element from the point of view of the text itself. Now, the what ifs. Now, for example, we have a character. Let's go back to characterization that we just did, yeah? Let's say I have this character of a girl, very, a white girl, obviously, with red hair, and she looks a bit boring, yeah? Like a very normal girl. Now, what if I change that character in terms of its, for example, age and occupation, or look of life? So, what if she's older? What would happen? What if she has different appearance? Appearance is not really that important, but we get the sense that probably the job will be different. It's not a schoolgirl. It's probably working in an office or a librarian or something like that. But if we take it further, for example, what if I change this character? If it is really an important character, or in the story, for example, what if I change this into a very different person? For example, a completely opposite, a goth, antisocial. Instead of a very normal-looking kind of girl, we have a very emo, very dark girl, goth girl. What if I change the race? What if I change the personality? What if even I change the gender? So those are good, tips to get you looking for topics to talk about, yes? And of course, we talk about Curious George. What if I change Curious George, for example, into less politically correct? Does it really matter? Yes, it matters. Because then we understand that Curious George is mostly educational to kids. He cannot be carrying weapons like this. We know that because what if I change? You get an experiment, a bit of a thought experiment with your mind. What if I change Curious George into a human? Yeah, why not? Or in this case, it looks like a girl, but Yeah, the shoes and the clothing. But what if I change that? Just to get an idea about what really happens in a text. Sometimes you need to play around like this to do with the what ifs. Now let's move on to ideas about essays that you can do with a plot. Some ideas. Now, of course, plot only works in prose fiction and drama. I don't think there is a plot in in poetry, although you still have characters and settings in poetry. Yeah. Some ideas is that you look at the sequence of events, see if that works or not, the action of all the characters, and the progress of events. Those are usually the focus when you want to talk about plot. Does it make sense if something happens? Now, this is mm, the graphs that shows, not a graph actually, a visualization of a plot. You start with exposition, rising conflict, rising action, you reach the peak climax, and then you have the falling action, and then the resolution or the denouement. So this is where the conflicts are being resolved. Yeah. So try to make a graph like this if you really want to. In the beginning, in the middle, and in the end. Does it make sense if it happens like that? Are there any plot holes? For example, a person is looking for his daughter, and then in the middle of the story he changes into finding his son, and then in the end he finds his wife. It's full of holes. It's not consistent. That's something worth talking about. Or is it really consistent? Or is it really good? How is the impact to the audience? How the sequence of the impact? You might remember Harry Potter or Da Vinci Code. It has a very thriller kind of what you call this plot, and that is the main. Some say that it will be the main attraction. It's not the setting of the wizardry or the character of Harry Potter, how he is kind and nice, or Hermione or Ronald Weasley in the Harry Potter, but it is about the plot, how the events start to unravel in a very interesting way, how time and space is bent, how is the impact. So those are the usual focus for plot discussion. Now there is another element, which is a narrative perspective. Now this is something a bit hard to do, because it includes the whole other element. Now if you talk about characters, you can only stick on the characters and you'll be fine, and touch a bit about the settings and the plot and how this character acts in a sequence of action. It's fine. You don't really have to say a lot about the other elements when you focus on the characterization. However, narrative perspective requires the whole element usually when you want to discuss of it. It is an interesting discussion, but it does not really have to be a very good discussion. Again, I must emphasize that the writing that you're to do in a literary analysis is what do you want to talk about. The focus is you. Don't take the focus on the text, how famous or how hard the text is. Don't take the focus to the teacher, what the teacher wants out of it, but focus instead on what you want to talk about, or in this case for the presentation, you and your group. So if you want to talk about the narrative perspective, you have to include a lot more to the process of storytelling beyond just the plot, beyond the sequence of events, more in the process of writing it. In this case, the creative process behind that, the creative writing process. And how do you explain this on the narrative perspective is you describe the effects on the main elements that matter. Are they better told that way? First person, third person? What are the strengths or weaknesses, if you find any? First person takes, as you remember, first person takes a very subjective and personal view of a story, while third person is taking a distance from the story. Horror and thriller usually uses first person because they really want you to take the front seat while reading. They really want you to feel scared, for example. While children literature usually take third person because they want to teach something, and it's easier to do teaching when you're doing third person. At least not every time, but most of the time. And you delve more into the what ifs. What if I change this? What if I change that? Will that matter? So it helps you to make an argument how the narrative perspective is important to talk about in an essay. Now, let us take an example of a discussion in the narrative perspective. We take a very modernist by Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway, a groundbreaking work for its time because it uses a stream of consciousness. This is neither first person, second person, or third person. This is something else. We call this stream of consciousness. Basically, the modernists, Virginia Woolf is one of the big figure here, created or popularized this way of telling things. Now let's read this. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. Is this third person? No, because she doesn't use quotation mark. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself for having lived in Westminster. How many years ago? Now we're changing into first person. How many years now? It looks like the author, like we ourselves, ask this question. Over 20, one feels even the memories of traffic working at night. Clarissa was probably a different character. Clarissa was paused of a particular hush, a solemnity, an indiscernible pause, a suspense. Now wait, what are we talking about? You talk about buying flowers and living in Westminster, and then Clarissa, and then there is a suspense. And then Big Ben strikes there. So this is very first person, out it boom. So it tries to replicate, to imitate how humans think. Because it's very personal that way. So you kind of go into somebody's mind and actually thinking and feeling whatever that person is feeling and thinking at that very moment. So it's like a very, very personal approach, probably more personal. And what is its effect? Why do we need to talk about it? The plot can be very fluid. Events just move. You don't have to stop for description. You don't have to stop for quotation marks even, or how to write a good sentence. This is one sentence. This whole thing is one sentence. There's no period. A very long sentence. And you can do whatever you want. The resulting thing is that if we take a look at the plot, it's very fluid, it's instantaneous, it's very fast-paced. The setting is very dreamy inside a person's mind. It can be very surreal as well. If that person is talking, for example, think about very dark thoughts or very philosophic thoughts, this whole description can be very surreal. And what if I change this into first person? The action will not be very fluid. Yes, it will not be very dreamy if I change it to first person and third person. Because of this consideration, we consider that the narrative perspective worth the spotlight, worth the main focus of what we're going to talk about if we want to talk about Virginia Woolf's Stream of Consciousness. For example, you read this book, and I advise you to read it because it's a good book, Mrs. Dalloway, and it really kills you that this is so very not traditional and it's very hard to understand. Therefore, you want to talk about it. So this is the whole point of making the literary, literary analysis, is that you want to talk about something you want to talk about because it's hard, because it's difficult. It doesn't have to be very clear to understand. This is like an experiment, You're having fun. Notice that I never talk about the data or the population or stuff like that. This is how we appreciate literary works. We look at it, we try to understand it, we try to find what we like, what exactly that we like, and we want to make a very concise and efficient discussion out of it by limiting the scope. Write it in a question and make a really good argumentation, explanation about it. So those are uh, the whole point of making an essay or an analysis in literary work is that it is an effort to better understand a literary text and let other people know what we think about it and to make a good argument of it. So I think that's all for my explanation. Of course, you can always and you should always consult the teacher if you don't understand how to approach a literary text because it can be mind-boggling and different and confusing if you're not careful. And but those are the usual steps that you have to take. So I think that's all, and thank you.